Today, we are covering what is known as the Pleistocene. This is a long time. Apparently, this epoch goes from about 2.5 million years ago, from when we first saw those bad-looking stone tools, up through about 12,000 years ago. Some people refer to this as the Stone Age, but technically, we're in the Pleistocene. Now, these tools are from about 500,000 years ago in South Africa, and you can see some of they're sharper. You have triangular points. So in the last class, we watched monkeys banging stones together and looking like things that humans or those other creatures could have produced inadvertently or without knowing it. These are not something that you just produce by banging rocks together randomly. And we'll see more examples of more sophisticated tools as we go along, but we're getting into things that were definitely produced by people intentionally making various tools and crafting them in ways. We also have this. That is cool. Yeah, we can't ask him his name, but that's what we call him. And so it's fine to forget it because he probably didn't go by this when he was around. We call him, well, that's going to be hard to say, Nariokotome Boy, the most complete Homo erectus skeleton from 1.6 million years ago, which is pretty cool. Look at all that skeletal stuff. All sorts of things, diet, growth patterns, walking ability, and in fact, this might have been almost 6 feet tall. Homo erectus at almost 6 feet here. Walking around, you can tell all kinds. When you got a skeleton like this, then you're in much better shape for being able to tell things. And fortunately, we also have some footprints. Those are always cool. Pretty much like ours now. Yeah, exactly. We have these footprints from about 1.5 million years ago. And basically, if you put our feet into the footprints, they look pretty much the same. That's a modern foot. They're walking pretty much just like us. You got your gait and alignment and stride, big toes pointing forward like ours. All those things are working out. So it's interesting to me. We talked about the Laetoli footprints from the Australopithecus species, which are probably more famous. In some ways, these might not be as famous because that's just like us. Who cares? We have here the evidence that Homo erectus was walking around very, very much like we do. We also, through a process called endocast. So actually, the brain itself doesn't fossilize. It goes away, but if you take what you have from the cranium and fill it in with stuff and try to figure out what was there, you get these ideas. We see that some of the first Homo erectus seem to be more ape-like in cranium and smaller, but some of the later ones seem to be larger and more approaching to the modern human type. So, this is not an exact science when you're making an endocast, but it's pretty cool. Pretty neat to be able to do that. We also see the Homo erectus go beyond those basic Oldowan tools. The Oldowan tools in this picture are displayed at the bottom here. Those are the things that you might be able to get just from smashing two stones together if you're good at it. But these tools have been reshaped again and sharpened along the edges. So they display multiple methods of manufacturing. These are called hand axes, and they're very famous in the archaeological record. There's a lot of them around, and they're very associated with Homo erectus. They cover a wide geographical area. The textbook calls them multifunctional, which means you can use them for lots of different things. This is in part because there's some debate about actually what they use these for. When they call them hand axes, you can't actually fasten a piece of wood to these. They call them hand axes because you'd somehow use or hold them in their hands, but the edges are pretty sharp. Again, there's some debate about what exactly these were used for. The term hand axe makes it sound like they're swinging an axe, but they're not. They're these shaped rocks. In any case, they seem to be better able to use and make tools in order to forage, that is, to gather wild plants, to do better scavenging. We talked about being able to swoop in after another animal has been killed and get the bone marrow or something from that, and for hunting. And so Homo erectus seems to be better at doing all of these things. Now, Homo erectus emerges in Africa around 2 million years ago with this more bipedalism, better gait. And then Homo erectus does something super cool. Homo erectus is the first species of hominin, the first bipedal species that we see spreading out not only across Africa, but goes into Europe and into Asia and gets all the way down to here and all the way out to here. So we have decent fossil evidence of Homo erectus in all these places. They seem to have a pretty small population size and they traveled in smaller groups. And we also see some pretty significant differences in the brain and body size across these different regions. So there's been some debate about whether all of these fossils actually belong in the same species. The current consensus is they do belong, but just with quite a bit of variability within them. So from the Homo erectus populations, we then have this period which is called the Middle Pleistocene Homo. Now, the finds in this time period were once called archaic Homo sapiens, which just means old or ancient Homo sapiens. But that's not the nicest thing to call people. It acts like they were just waiting around to turn into Homo sapiens and hadn't gotten there yet. So our textbook, and I agree with them, agrees that what we should call these is Middle Pleistocene Homo, because they seem to be somewhere between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. And they're also age-wise somewhere between. They emerged from around 800,000 to around 300,000 years ago. Now, some paleoanthropologists and archaeologists have referred to this period as the muddle in the middle, because at about 2 million years ago, you see these very clear Homo erectus types, and you see Homo erectus spread into different regions. And then at 300 or more like 200,000 years ago, you see very clear Homo sapiens, and you see Homo sapiens spread out. But what happened in this period is there's a lot of regional variability and a lot of claims have been made about how many species there might have been and what they were doing in these various regions. I will just agree with the authors that we will call these the Middle Pleistocene Homos instead of acting like they were on their way to being something. We don't know what they would have done. They did do something cool with their tools, though. What kind of technique did they have? Yeah, this being able to really be more delicate with those tools. And so you get, at this period, you get actually things that were put onto wood and could be more like spears or projectiles, as well as different scrapers and knives. What can you do with those great tools? What do we find them doing? Evidence of hunting, butchering. Oh, good. Woodworking too. Yeah, that's another thing, and create different weapons. And so we see here a transition. They're probably still scavenging in some ways, but there's more hunting being incorporated into the diet, and the tools they have more facility to do that. I want to pause here and just say that what we're seeing here is the emergence of more sophisticated hunting and gathering techniques. And everybody gets very excited about the hunting part because there's a little bit of a male bias in archaeology that tends to emphasize this man, the hunter aspect. But when we look around at contemporary gathering and hunting groups, it's really the women of the group and the gathering of wild plants and tubers and berries that make up usually the majority of the calories in any of these groups. And these tools would have helped for that as well. And so I just want to place there that we often, in the archaeological record, we often are looking for, and the hunting stuff perhaps shows up more than the gathering stuff, but the people at this time, the Middle Pleistocene Homos, are developing a more sophisticated gathering and hunting techniques, which would allow them to move into more areas. We also see the first real evidence for control of fire. Now, there's a lot of debate about exactly when fire was used and if it was controlled or not. Some people want to put that back more like 2 million years ago with Homo erectus, or like 1 million years ago. The best evidence, though, is that it emerges really in this period from about 400,000 years ago. And if you have fire, well, what can you do with fire? Cook. You can cook with fire, and that gives you more calories. And by the way, if you're going to have expanded brain size, one of the disadvantages to having these big heads is they require a lot of calories, especially when they're developing. And so these kids with their big heads coming around, you need to feed them a lot of food. And so being able to cook with fire is probably an important part of this process. It's not always easy to spend resources on your kids when they're running around with big heads and can't do too much yet. So we have the evidence for a controlled fire. Now, in the Middle Pleistocene, we have different groups that display different continental differences. So we saw that the Homo erectus spreads out into these various places, and then from those populations, these various Middle Pleistocene Homo emerge, and they seem to emerge differently in different places. It seems that the large-brained Homo, the ones with the largest brains, appear first in Africa at about 800,000 years ago, and they start to look more like modern humans by around 200,000 years ago. If we look at the ones that we see in Europe, we see a pretty wide different range of cranial forms of the Middle Pleistocene. So some with large and some with small, all over the place. And then in Asia, where also Homo erectus and Middle Pleistocene was, you see this, what they call a mix of Homo erectus and Middle Pleistocene features. Now, again in Africa, in Morocco, this was a discovery from just a few years ago. Some of the first more modern-looking human skulls and most features that are associated with anatomical modernity in humans. And so these were found in a cave in Morocco. Again, this is northwestern Africa. This was an exciting discovery, both because it pushed back a little bit the boundaries of when Homo sapiens emerged, but it also meant that most of our discoveries have been in this area of Africa. It probably meant that stuff was going on across Africa. We just don't have a lot of fossilized evidence for what was going on in these areas. What it seems, however, is that modern Homo sapiens developed, and the best fossil evidence we have for this is around 200,000 years ago in this area of Africa. So we have this Middle Pleistocene Homo derived from Homo erectus in these different regions, displaying a variability in their cranial shape, body size, and all these things. And it's long been a question about what happened to these groups. One model in anthropology was called the multi-regional model. And what it postulated is that modern humans would have evolved simultaneously in all of these regions, but we were always connected by gene flow. Now, I want to just pause and be careful here. This model has been misinterpreted by some who think that this model represents that Homo sapiens evolved differently in different regions. The multi-regional model always postulated that this was one interbreeding species, and they would share these advantageous traits across the range through gene flow. It's just that the evolution would have happened simultaneously across these regions, and they would show some similarities with the populations that had existed in these regions before. More recently, the genetic evidence seems to favor something that we're now calling an assimilation model. And the genetic evidence on this is actually pretty clear and has been for the last 30 years or so with some modifications, which is basically that modern humans originate, modern Homo sapiens begin in Africa at about 200,000 years ago. They then migrate out of Africa and they replace the other Homo species that were living in these places. Now, for a long time, the genetic evidence seemed to suggest that there was no intermixture between the Homo sapiens that were coming out of Africa and the existing populations in these regions. More recently, it seems there is some intermixture, some interbreeding with those earlier populations in different parts, and we'll talk about that, but it's only in a small amount. So basically, the assimilation model still holds as the major model for human evolution. So we have here our own species of Homo sapiens. And again, the genetic evidence and the fossil evidence converge on the idea that all humans today descend from around 30,000 Homo sapiens who were in sub-Saharan Africa around 200 to 250,000 years ago. So that's when we see the first fossil evidence as well as where our genetic evidence takes us back to. And from Africa, they then go out and travel. They populate the globe in stages. And so they give you this is a pretty good map of how we think this occurred. So we have the emergence of Homo sapiens here around 200,000 years ago, spreading out first into various parts of Africa, being connected there, and then coming into what we would call the Middle East, maybe a little bit before this, maybe about 100,000 years ago, but maybe more like 75,000 years ago. And from there, going over, cross into India at about 65,000 years ago, down here in Southeast Asia about 65,000 years ago. And then they do something super incredible. Where do they go from there? Start with Australia. Right. Actually, Australia at about 65,000 years ago. So they go beyond that range of Homo erectus. They cross this body of water here and go into Australia, which is an enormously amazing feat. Populate the continent of Australia, chill out there for a while. Then go up here into the northern reaches, over into Europe at about 45,000 years ago, Japan at 35,000 years ago, up here at about 25,000 years ago, and then into the Americas, probably 15 to 16,000 years ago, coming into these populations. Interestingly, some of these islands in the Pacific, we saw this with the pottery stuff in archaeology. We just hinted at this, that there was some of these islands were later populated by Polynesians as recently as 1,000 years ago, like New Zealand and Hawaii over here into Easter Island too. So these were also incredible voyages, but they were much later than some of these earlier populations. So we see this spread from Africa into other parts of the world in stages. Now, our textbook talks to us about these Homo sapiens also becoming behaviorally modern. So we see anatomically modern humans emerge about 200,000 years ago in Africa. People that would look very anatomically similar to us. But our textbook also talks to us about behavioral modernity. It's an interesting idea. So starting to do more complex things and being able to plan things, make social structures and societies communicate. And the current consensus on this is that this behavioral modernity emerges a little bit later after anatomical modernity, around 150,000 years ago in Africa, in a gradual process, and from Africa goes into the rest of the world. So as you saw in a little world map, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, don't travel out of Africa until after they develop these behaviorally modern ideas. Now, I just want to note here that there may be a little bit of an archaeological illusion of this gap between anatomical modernity and behavioral modernity. Now, this is my interpretation based on some other stuff I'm bringing in, more recent studies in the textbook. But what we used to think, because most of our evidence came from archaeology that was done in Europe, and so you'd go into the cave paintings and say in France, which are beautiful, and you should go see them if you can, from about 40,000 years ago. And there's all sorts of archaeological evidence of what Homo sapiens were doing in France and Spain and those areas of Europe from about 40,000 years ago. And so people were like, oh, wow, there's this huge gap between anatomically modern humans and these humans that can do this art and stuff in Europe 40,000 years ago. And so there was all these ideas that somehow there might have been some mutation that gave us this new abilities. And what we are discovering as we do more archaeology in Africa is that there wasn't as much of a gap as people are imagining. There are a lot of similar things that are happening in Africa. It's just that the archaeological studies weren't done there. They were mostly funded by European institutions, and so they didn't go into Africa. And so we're now narrowing that gap more and more. And so if we think about something like art, it's incredible they can even do it. To be able to put some art and do those kinds of things is incredible. It displays an incredible level of sophistication. And what we see is that the use of color and body art and various figurines, we see evidence of that at least 75,000 years ago in southern Africa. And then we see cave paintings in France and Indonesia 45,000 years ago. Now, I've underlined Indonesia here, and I keep harping on Africa and for a reason. It's because, again, the French cave paintings have been incredibly explored and analyzed. We've recently found that there were also cave paintings of similar age, or maybe even older, in Indonesia, which means that the package of behavioral modernity, which gives us things like art, surely was a package of traits that emerges in Africa and then spreads into the rest of the world. This is just a cool example of the Sulawesi cave art in Indonesia, which is pretty cool stuff. We also see as elements of behavioral modernity, language and speech. It's hard to necessarily infer speech from fossils, but there's various ways that we try to do that. And of course, human speech involves gestures, involves signing, involves various ways. And being able to do what we talked about in the last class, cumulative culture, means being able to pass these knowledge across the generations. And so being able to use symbols, talked about this in our first classes, being able to associate meaning with symbols is crucial to passing on knowledge across these generations. So we see the emergence of these traits called behavioral modernity, art, language, speech, forming a package of things so that these Homo sapiens become very flexible and adaptable in different landscapes. So you have this brain-body connection with the frontal cortex, being able to transmit stuff over time, which definitely helps if you're trying to do that apprentice-style learning and teach people how to make things and develop that cumulative culture over time and develop more specialized tools and being able to use those tools to go into more extreme climates. And so here we have Homo sapiens adapting, changing their toolkit, going into different climates. We also see the emergence of clothing, getting more fitted to Homo sapien bodies. By the way, clothing doesn't fossilize very well in the record. How do we know that Homo sapiens were probably wearing clothing? What's our evidence for that? This is just a little fun fact about how we find things, genetically speaking. The emergence of different species of body lice, which only live in clothing, are also associated with this time period. So we know that they were wearing clothes because lice start to diverge, and different kinds of lice that live in your hair and live on your bodies become different species. You can be happy about clothing for that. Also, you see different forms of shelters. And very importantly, we see that these Homo sapiens engage in trade and exchange across these groups. So unlike these Homo erectus populations that were more small grouped and more disconnected from each other, you see long distance trade emerge from the beginning with Homo sapiens. And you see this across Africa. Africa is a very huge continent, and you see these long distance trade routes between the north and south, between the east and west, and people trading things around to make things like art and tools for hundreds of thousands of years. And this carries forward as Homo sapiens spread into different parts of the world. They continue these trade routes. So it's really interesting. In all parts of the world, you see these long trades. People will get things from one place and trade them along until they get to a completely different place. Your book does give you a table 6.2 that gives you the stuff that people look for anatomically, and then gives you stuff that look for associated with humanness and how you might look for that in the archaeological record. But we have here the emergence of this very flexible group of creatures, bipedal Homo sapiens, who are able to migrate, to travel, and to adapt their tools into different climates, talk to each other, trade, and develop